Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going deep on a topic that I think will surprise a lot of you.
Oh, yeah. It's one of those stories that you don't hear a lot about, but it
Yeah.
really has some crazy
It
implications.
really does. So we're talking about the Chagos Archipelago.
Okay.
It's a group of islands in the Indian Ocean, and we're specifically focusing on one called Diego Garcia.
Okay.
And to guide our deep dive today, we're using an article that you sent in called Who Owns Diego Garcia? Decolonization and Indigenous Rights in the Indian Ocean.
Yeah.
It's by Jeffrey Robertson, QC. Have you heard of him?
Yes, he's fantastic.
Yeah.
Really digs into the legal and historical stuff here.
Yeah, he does a really good job, and it's a really fascinating article. So we're going to explore the history of these islands, the different claims to ownership, and the ethical and legal complexities that kind of surround the whole thing.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack.
There is.
Yeah.
So let's set the scene.
Okay.
Imagine pristine beaches, crystal clear, turquoise waters, swaying palm trees.
Sounds idyllic.
It really
Yeah,
does. This is the Chagos Archipelago.
Well,
A true tropical paradise.
there's always a but.
Yeah, its beauty masks a really difficult history. These islands were first settled by the French in the 18th century, and they relied on enslaved people to work the coconut plantations.
Oh, wow. So even a paradise like that has this dark side to it.
It really does.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder that even the most idyllic places can be built on exploitation.
Right.
Okay, so now let's fast forward to the 19th century. Britain takes control of the Chagos Islands, and they become part of the colony of Mauritius.
Okay.
But it's important to note that the islands were actually administered from the Mauritian capital, Port Louis.
Which is interesting because that suggests a strong link between the two.
It does. It wasn't just some random arrangement.
Right.
It shows a really close relationship between Mauritius and the Chagos Islands, rooted in law and recognized internationally.
Okay. So they were very much connected.
They were. And then comes a major turning point, and this happens in the 1960s.
Right.
The Cold War is in full swing,
Ah, yes, the Cold War.
and the U.S. is searching for strategic locations to set up their military bases.
Makes sense given the geopolitical climate at the time.
Right, and that's when they set their sights on Diego Garcia.
And why Diego Garcia?
Well, from a military perspective, it was a prime location. It's isolated, which adds a layer of security, and it's also strategically positioned in the middle of important shipping lanes.
Ah, so it's like a key access point.
It is. So the U.S. approaches the U.K., who still had control over the Chagos Islands, remember, as part of Mauritius.
Right.
And here's where things get really interesting. A secret deal is struck.
A secret deal. What was it?
The U.K. agrees to separate the Chagos Archipelago from Mauritius just before granting Mauritius its independence.
Wow. So they're basically carving up this territory before granting it freedom.
Exactly. And this move caused a huge uproar internationally. It was seen by many as a blatant violation of international law and the UN's principles of decolonization.
I can see why people would be outraged.
Yeah, it was a big deal. Because the UN, strongly emphasizes the principle of granting independence to territories as complete units.
They want to keep things whole, right?
Right, they want to avoid creating these fragmented states.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So this decision by the UK to split up Mauritius before granting it independence went against everything the UN stood for.
And I'm guessing the UN had something to say about this.
They did. The UN explicitly condemned this action. But the UK's argument was that they had reached an agreement with the Mauritian delegation involved in the independence negotiations.
But I'm guessing it wasn't that straightforward.
Not really. The article suggests that it was more of an ultimatum given to the Mauritians, basically saying, give up Chagos or risk delaying your independence.
So they were put in a really tough spot.
They were. And it raises questions about whether the Mauritian delegation actually had the authority to just give away part of their nation's territory.
That's a really important point. Do they actually have the power to make that decision?
And even if they technically did, was their consent truly given freely under such intense pressure?
Right. Were they really in a position to say no?
Exactly. It's a really murky situation. And sadly, in the midst of all this political maneuvering, the people who actually lived on these islands, so the Chagossian people, they were essentially forgotten.
Yeah, what happened to them?
They became the victims of this Cold War chess game. Pawns sacrificed for strategic gain.
It's tragic how often that happens.
It is. The UK forcibly removed the entire Chagossian population from their homeland, deporting them to Mauritius and the Seychelles.
The whole population?
The entire population. They were sent away in really appalling conditions, packed onto overcrowded ships, given very little notice. They were ripped from their homes, the places their families had known for generations.
Wow, that's just heartbreaking to be uprooted like that so suddenly.
It is, and it gets worse. The UK went to great lengths to try and downplay the situation.
To avoid any negative attention, I'm sure.
Exactly. They tried to avoid international scrutiny. They claimed that the Chagossians were simply temporary workers, not real inhabitants, with deep ties to the islands.
So basically trying to erase their connection to the land?
Exactly. But the article reveals some internal UK documents that use derogatory terms to describe the Chagossians.
What kind of terms?
Terms like Tarzans and Man Fridays.
Wow, that's dehumanizing.
It is, and it really reveals this deeply dismissive attitude towards their rights and their cultural identity.
It's like they were seen as less than human.
Yeah, and upon arriving in Mauritius, many of these Chagossians were just left to fend for themselves in poverty.
So they were abandoned by the UK, who expelled them.
And also by Mauritius, who really lacked the resources to adequately support them.
It's a double betrayal.
It really is. So while the US and the UK were busy building this massive military base on Diego Garcia,
The base they went to such lengths to acquire.
exactly, the Chagossian people were struggling to rebuild their lives in exile.
A tragic consequence of these power plays.
Yeah, and this base would go on to play a major role in U.S. military operations,
Oh, yeah.
including the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Wow, so it became a really significant asset for the U.S.
It did. But throughout all of this, the UK kept saying that they would return the islands to Mauritius.
Oh, they did?
They said they would do it once they were no longer needed for defense purposes.
So there was like a light at the end of the tunnel?
That's what they promised.
Yeah.
But as we'll see, these promises proved to be hollow.
They didn't follow through.
Oh, they really raise a lot of questions about the UK's true intentions.
Okay, so there's more to this story.
There's a lot more to it. And as we dig deeper, we'll uncover evidence that suggests Diego Garcia may have been used for something even more sinister.
More sinister than a military base. What are you talking about?
Well, recent revelations indicate that it may have been used by the U.S. for extraordinary rendition flights.
Okay, I've heard of those. What are they exactly?
These flights involve transporting suspected terrorists to secret locations for interrogation. And often these interrogations involve techniques that many would consider torture.
Oh, wow. So this paradise, this island that was once home to a vibrant community, could have been used for some pretty dark purposes.
That's the implication. And it's a chilling thought.
It is. And to add another layer of complexity here, remember, Diego Garcia is British territory.
Yeah.
So these allegations raise serious legal and ethical questions about the UK's role in all of this.
Right, because they're ultimately responsible for what happens on their territory.
So exactly. Did they know about these activities? Did they allow them to happen? These are questions that demand answers.
They really do.
Yeah.
So as all of this was unfolding, the Chagossian people never gave up hope of returning home.
I can only imagine how strong their desire to go back must have been.
Yeah, it's an incredible story of resilience. They launched legal challenges in British courts trying to fight for their right to return.
And did they make any progress?
They did achieve some victories along the way, but the UK government, using its power and influence, repeatedly blocked their efforts to return.
Wow. So it's a classic David and Goliath situation.
It really is. The Chagossians facing off against a powerful government that seems determined to maintain control.
And it's not just about the physical return, right?
It's not. It's also about recognition,
Okay.
about justice,
Yeah,
and about having a chance to heal the wounds of this painful past.
absolutely. The legal and political situation is incredibly complex.
It is.
But the Chagossian people's determination to reclaim their homeland, their heritage, is incredibly powerful.
It really is inspiring. You know, it's incredible how, even after being forcibly removed, the Chagossians never gave up on their home.
It's amazing, really. They never stopped fighting for the right to return.
They didn't. And their legal battles, they often got tied to this question of UK sovereignty over the islands.
Right, so like whether the UK even had the right to claim ownership in the first place.
Exactly. And, you know, those early challenges, they focused on getting back to the islands under the assumption that the UK did have legitimate sovereignty.
Okay.
But as Robertson points out in the article, that assumption itself is super problematic.
Right, from the beginning.
Yeah. Let's rewind a bit, though, to those early legal challenges. You mentioned some crucial documents that came to light in the year 2000.
Oh, yeah. These were some Foreign and Commonwealth Office documents.
Okay.
They came out during a legal challenge by some Chagossian families in British courts.
Okay. And what do they reveal?
They showed that the UK government intentionally misled the UN about the Chagossian population.
Oh, wow. So they were trying to downplay their connection to the islands.
Exactly.
And this must have been a huge turning point in the public's perception of the whole situation.
Oh, for sure. There was a ton of public pressure after that.
Okay.
Even Robin Cook, the foreign secretary at the time,
Yeah.
he acknowledged how messed up it was.
Wow. So that's a big deal coming from someone so high up.
It was. He even started a feasibility study to see if they could actually return.
Oh, so like a glimmer of hope for the Chagossians?
Kind of. But it was limited.
In what way?
They said the return couldn't include Diego Garcia.
Because of the base.
Exactly. The U.S. base was already there, and no one wanted to mess with that.
So not a complete victory then. More like a compromise that still left them without their main island.
Right. But there's more. In 2002, they won another legal victory.
What was it?
They were granted the right to British passports.
Wow. So they finally became recognized as British citizens.
Yep. A lot of them used that to move to England, you know, for a better life and to keep fighting.
Makes sense. But then what happened in 2004?
Yeah. That was a huge step back.
What happened?
The UK government issued a new order in council.
Okay, I have to admit, I don't really know what that is.
It's basically a way for the UK government to make laws without going through Parliament.
Okay, and why is that important here?
Well, they used this order in council to officially take away the Chagossians' right to return.
Oh, wow. So all that progress they made just got wiped away.
Basically. And the U.S. even released a statement thanking the UK for stopping resettlement.
Oh, wow.
They said it would compromise security at Diego Garcia. Yep. But that's the thing. Robertson's article totally debunks that whole security argument.
Okay, how so?
He said it's ridiculous to think that letting the Chagossians back on those outer islands would threaten the base.
Right, because they're so far away from Diego Garcia.
Exactly. He said the only criminal activity there at the time was Somali pirates.
Okay.
And pirates wouldn't go anywhere near a U.S. military base.
Right, that makes sense. So it seems like they were just making excuses.
Yeah, to please the U.S. and keep control.
Okay. But the Chagossians didn't give up.
Right? They didn't. They challenged that order in council, saying it was illegal.
And what happened?
They won first in the High Court, then again in the Court of Appeal.
Wow, so 7 judges ruled in their favor.
That's right.
Sounds like justice was about to be served.
It seemed like it. But then they took it to the highest court in the UK, the House of Lords.
Oh, no. And they lost.
They did. It was a super close decision, though, 3-2.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
So after a decade of legal battles, they still couldn't go home.
Nope. It was a huge blow. But they kept fighting. They took their case to the European Court of Human Rights.
Oh, wow. Did that help?
Not really. They got stuck on jurisdictional issues.
So all those legal challenges, they were based on this idea that the UK had legitimate sovereignty.
Right. But Robertson argues that that's a faulty premise to begin with.
Okay. So if the UK's claim is questionable, what does that mean for the Chagossians' right to return?
Well, it means they might have other options.
Like what?
Robertson says Mauritius never actually gave up its claim to the Chagos archipelago.
So they could still fight for those islands.
Exactly. Robertson suggests that they could sue the UK in the International Court of Justice, the ICJ.
That's like the World Court, right?
It is. They handle disputes between countries.
Okay. So why haven't they done that yet?
There's a big obstacle, and it has to do with the whole history of colonialism.
Okay, I'm listening.
Both the UK and Mauritius have these reservations about the ICJ's jurisdiction.
Okay.
They basically can't sue each other because they're both part of the Commonwealth. Wait, so that means the UK can't be sued by former colonies because of this system they set up?
It's a pretty messed up situation. It's like they're protected from being held accountable for their actions.
Yeah, that doesn't seem fair. So if the ICJ route is blocked, does Mauritius have any other options?
Well, Robertson mentions a few. They could try going to an international tribunal.
Okay.
They could argue that that marine protected area around Chagos was a violation of international law.
Oh, right, that whole thing.
Yeah.
The one that Robertson says was basically a way to keep the Chagossians out?
Exactly. They actually already filed a claim with the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea.
Oh, wow. So they're already pursuing that.
They are. There's also the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination.
Okay. How could they use that?
They could say that expelling the Chagossians and not letting them back is a type of racial discrimination.
Okay.
And that they deserve compensation.
So those are some interesting strategies.
Yeah.
But do they really solve the sovereignty issue?
That's the thing. They might wrought some justice and put pressure on the UK.
Yeah.
But they don't directly address who actually owns the islands.
Right. So what about this idea of arbitration that Robertson talks about?
That's definitely something to consider.
Yeah.
Since the UK basically forced Mauritius to give up its right to sue in the ICJ,
Okay.
You could argue that they should agree to this binding arbitration process.
So basically resolve the dispute in a more neutral setting.
Exactly. They'd both present their arguments to an impartial panel and then get a binding resolution.
It sounds like a good idea in theory, but would the UK actually agree to it?
That's the big question. Robertson's not too optimistic.
Yeah, why not?
He says the UK won't budge on its claim to Chagos.
It's like they refuse to even have a real conversation about it.
It's all about power. And it shows how former colonial powers can avoid taking responsibility for their actions.
Okay, so if arbitration's off the table, what else can Mauritius do?
There's one more option that Robertson suggests. It involves the UN General Assembly.
Oh, interesting. How would that work?
Yeah. Mauritius could ask the General Assembly to get an advisory opinion from the ICJ on the sovereignty question.
Ah, okay, so they can't directly sue the UK, but the General Assembly can get the court's opinion on it.
Exactly. And even though an advisory opinion isn't legally binding like a court judgment,
Okay.
it carries a lot of weight morally and politically.
I see. So the UK would have a hard time ignoring it, especially if it came from the UN General Assembly.
That's the idea.
It's a long shot, but it could finally give them an impartial legal assessment of the UK's claim.
It would definitely be a big step towards justice for the Chagossians.
Yeah, it would force the UK to face the consequences of their actions on the world stage.
And we've come a long way from talking about the forced expulsion of the Chagossian people to discussing potential solutions at the UN.
We have. It really shows how the fight for justice can take many different forms.
Yeah, it shows the resilience of people and the power of international law, even if it's not perfect.
Absolutely. So we've talked about the forced removal, the legal battles, and now a potential challenge at the UN. It's quite a journey.
It really is. And it shows that the fight for the Chagos Islands is far from over.
Right. But it also raises a whole bunch of new questions, like what happens if Mauritius actually wins this sovereignty claim? What happens to the Chagossian people? Would they finally be able to go home?
It's what they've been fighting for all these years, but it's not a simple situation.
No. What are some of the things they would have to consider?
Well, for starters, the U.S. still has a lease on Diego Garcia until 2036. So even if the U.K. is out of the picture, Mauritius would have to negotiate with the U.S. about the future of the base.
And I imagine the U.S. isn't just going to pack up and leave. Diego Garcia's pretty strategically important to them.
Exactly. Robertson says that Mauritius would probably be open to letting the U.S. keep using the base, but it would have to be on new terms.
Right, not a deal forced on them by a colonial power.
Right. It would be an agreement between two sovereign nations.
Which hopefully would be a fairer arrangement, one that actually takes into account the rights and interests of the Chagossian people.
Yeah, that's the key question here. What would it actually mean for the Chagossians to return to their homeland if there's still this massive U.S. military base there? Could they coexist? Would they even want to?
Those are really tough questions. And ultimately, only the Chagossians themselves can answer them.
Absolutely. They need to be the ones making the decisions about their own future.
And there's another layer to this, too, the environmental impact.
Oh, right. The marine protected area.
Yeah, the one that Robertson argues was created to keep the Chagossians out.
Yeah. It's been called a conservation success story. But it's also raised questions about whether it was just a way to control the islands.
So if Mauritius takes back the islands, what do they do with this protected area?
That's a big decision. Do they keep it as is? Do they change it to allow people to live there?
Yeah.
Or do they get rid of it altogether?
It's a tough balancing act. You've got environmental concerns, the needs of the Chagossian people, and then the whole strategic situation with the U.S. military.
It shows that even when you achieve a victory, like regaining your sovereignty, there are still difficult choices to be made.
Yeah, there's no easy answer that's going to make everyone happy.
Right.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the story of Diego Garcia, what are the main takeaways for our listeners?
I think one of the biggest lessons here is that colonialism has a really long-lasting impact. Even decades after independence, former colonies are still dealing with the consequences of colonial rule.
And it's clear that what the UK did in Diego Garcia was wrong. They broke international law, disregarded the rights of the Chagossian people, and they put their own interests above basic human dignity.
It's a story about the abuse of power, the fight for self-determination, and the legacy of colonialism.
And it shows how important it is to hold powerful nations accountable for their actions, even when they try to hide behind legal loopholes or national security.
But on a more positive note, the Chagossians' fight for justice is incredibly inspiring. It shows that even when the odds are stacked against you, you can still stand up and demand your rights.
We started by asking who owns Diego Garcia. And while that legal battle continues, I think the real question is, what does true justice look like for the Chagossian people?
Exactly. It's not just about who owns the land. It's about recognizing the harm that was done, addressing the needs of the community, and ensuring that their voices are heard.
It's a question that we all need to think about because ultimately the fight for justice in Diego Garcia is a fight for a better world. A world where everyone's rights are respected.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating story.